Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that really wonderful lecture. I see people in the chat been talking; they've really been appreciating as well. So we thank you so much for sharing with us. I want to open it up to some questions for folks. Most certainly, Nathan shared with us that you can use the Q&A feature in the chat there or in the Zoom room here. So if folks have questions, please do share those now for Dr. Smith here. We have a couple of minutes, about 10 minutes or so, for some Q&A. So please do share. I can start us off while folks are formulating. I do have a question for Dr. Smith while folks are sharing some stuff in the chat. I'm really curious. I know that you made a point in your lecture to focus on this idea of biblically literate African American women. How do they engage with folks that may have not been biblically literate, right? And didn't have access to the text and scriptures and interpretive sites that they were engaging with? How did they engage those communities of non-biblically literate women that were also potentially looking for how do we interpret our experience and faith in light of what we're going through?
Yeah, yeah. So I hear two questions in that. The first is it sounded like because you kind of went out. Sorry, my Wi-Fi went out.
Oh, okay. Oh, no problem. No
I
problem.
heard the first what I heard was you asking how they engaged non-biblically literate
Yes.
people in communities. So the
Yes.
first thing, is that right? Okay.
Correct.
So
That's correct. Mhm.
so one of the first things that's really important to get in terms of a contextual marker with these 19th century women is that in the 19th century, everybody in America, everybody was somewhat biblically literate. And African American communities in particular are because what you find is literally these women, most of these women learn to read and write by reading and writing the Bible, right? So that it's almost like I think it's a piece of American history, education history that I think gets lost. That one of the prime texts in which people, not just African American communities, but communities in the nation are learning to read and write and deploy English in any number of ways is through the Bible. And so, in some ways, you're dealing with a Bible speaking, Bible reading, Bible deploying, at least at the level of rhetoric and communication and expression nation. So it's not the same kind of biblical illiteracy that we're talking about nowadays when we talk about engaging with communities that are unchurched, for instance, right? So when we use language of what does it mean to have students or people in our communities that are unchurched, they don't know the Bible. That's really not the case there. Remember, there's not Instagram. We don't have Snapchat. We don't have a
Right.
TV. Probably don't even necessarily have a radio. You get what I'm saying? And so
Sure. Sure.
it's
Mhm,
the
mhm,
literature of entertainment as well
mhm,
as spirituality,
mhm,
as well as learning. It is the Bible. So then the
mhm,
question becomes for me, what are they doing with the
mhm,
Bible? How
mhm,
are they making meaning of it? How are they
mhm,
deploying it to understand and articulate their theological understandings, their beliefs, their social positions, and what can we learn from their
mhm,
particular practice of interpreting the Bible for their own communal meanings and
sure.
understanding?
Mm.
Does that help kind of get to that?
Absolutely. 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 We've got a couple of questions here we can pose here. Um, someone's asking, I'm wondering if Dr. Smith would affirm with some Black liberation theologians that oppressed communities are positioned closer to the horizon of the biblical text than other contemporary readers, and therefore maybe they may be the best vehicle for reading closer to the meaning of the text. So if I could maybe condense this down, what's your perspective and your opinion on whether Black liberation theologians and their approach to the biblical text, and are those persons maybe the best vehicles for reading closer to the meaning of the text and looking at the text for contemporary readers?
Yeah. So I'm gonna fiddle with it just a little bit to say.
Yeah, no problem.
So one of my fiddling pieces will be on the question of whether, when I approach the New Testament writings,
Mhm,
I always have to make a calibration that says these writings are fundamentally coming from the communities on the margin. They come from and are
mhm,
written
mhm,
towards
mhm,
communities that are in
mhm,
constant negotiation of their social status and understandings within their communities and outside of it. So it's
mhm,
insider literature
Mhm.
for communities that are fundamentally on the fringes of their
Mhm.
larger world orders, local
Mhm.
spaces, and larger empire. I have to
Mhm.
do that. I have to tell myself that
Mhm.
because you read it differently when you
Mhm.
realize
Mhm.
something like where I play, First Peter, for instance, is
Mhm.
written for communities that are managing local discrimination, right?
Mhm.
And those
Mhm. Mhm.
discriminations are not just tactics of name calling, but they also have they have real implications for the survival rate of those
Mhm.
communities, right? In a real way. In that way, I think liberation exegetical approaches are helpful because one
Okay.
of the things um, I'm an exegete, so I'm going to move a little bit away from theology in that way.
I
Talk
got you. I
about it
got you.
exegetically speaking. Exegetically speaking, what I find helpful about liberation
Mhm.
theological approaches is that they are pushing to get the initial location right, right? The
Mhm.
place of,
Mhm.
is this from an empowered group or a powerless group? Is
Mhm.
this from a
Mhm.
targeted group or is this from
Mhm.
the group that is targeting, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's a necessary modification
Mhm.
critique that's fundamentally running through
Mhm.
liberation theologies is the suspicion that the
Mhm.
biblical text is being read, interpreted, and deployed from places of
Mhm.
center and power
Mhm.
when they were actually written from the reverse. Now, the
Okay.
last thing I'll say about this that I think is really important to name is that this becomes all the more um, interesting and
Mhm.
complicated when you look at a text like Second Peter, in which it looks like it's engaging in a kind of power play bullying, right? But it's not in the same location. This is what is happening within the community, as opposed to First Peter, which is a dynamic of the community and the larger local environment
Mhm.
that it
Mhm.
that it
Mhm.
that it is in. So um, getting the location right is key, and I get that
Okay.
from ancient theologies.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Got you. Got you. We've probably got time for maybe one more question here. Okay. So here's a question. So out of all that you shared, what is the most important exegetical practice should we take from the example of these women you've mentioned today for biblical interpretation? So I'm sure there's many, but if you could name maybe one or two exegetical practices, what should we take from these women that apply to our approach to biblical text interpretation for today?
Yeah. Um, so getting the location right is one.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
the second thing I think we have to take from it really is the demand it makes on us in our contemporary society and Bible interpreting communities to move away from this radical subjectivity that is so individualized and
Mm.
separated from other communities. So this
Mm.
me and I interpretation
Mm.
that is supposedly that has no sort of doesn't have to be isn't accountable to the larger interpretive
Mm.
community, doesn't have to serve larger
Yeah.
interpretive
Yeah.
communities and their experiences, doesn't have to speak to because it's my personal
Mhm.
interpretation. Even when they are talking about their own, especially when you look at the spiritual autobiographies of someone like Jarena Lee, Julia Foote, Zilpha Elo, even when they're talking about their own personal revelations and
Mhm. Mhm.
encounters with God,
Mhm.
it always leads them back into community. And they
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
have a community
That's
with,
good. That's
that
good.
cloud of witnesses that is
Mhm.
always
Mhm.
interacting with them in their
Mhm.
biblical interpretation. You saw that even with Lee talking about the very publication of her
Yeah.
biography as a
Mhm.
piece. And I think that is an important
Yeah.
element that we need to
Yeah.
retrieve.
Yeah.
Our interpretive communities that we associate with or are not
Yeah.
associated with, that we are formed by or refusing to be formed by, that matters to what
Mhm.
we do
Mhm.
in New Testament studies.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that can't
Mhm.
be discounted. Does
Mhm.
that help? Does
Mhm.
that help?
It helps me out. According to the chat, it helps a whole lot of people out in terms of
All
that
right.
response. So I think I most certainly think that's the case. This one last question beyond your book, because I most certainly know folks are looking to grab that. Are there any other readings, other resources you encourage us to take a look at to follow up on looking at these women as biblical interpreters, to follow up for further conversation discussion?
Yeah, so a great sort of definitive work that's really great is Sisters of the Spirit, which is a book that has Jarena Lee, Zilpha Elah, and AJ Foots, Julia Foots, spiritual autobiographies right there for you. Another book that I love, particularly for biblical study, for theological studies, is Marcia Riggs' Can I Get a Witness? In which she, again, has excerpts, primary source material of these 19th century all the way up to early 20th century African-American women. So there's nothing like reading them with these texts, and reading them, here you go, with your Bibles open. So read them and let them tell you what biblical texts are important and how they read it. And then you go read that text for yourself and see if you see what they see.
And then to your last comments there, read it in communion with other people too.
Read it
So
in
bring come
community with
together.
other
Yes,
people.
ma'am.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I would say I always heard people say, "What do I do when I'm so
Mhm.
tired of
Mhm.
the Bible?" The Bible, like
Mhm.
it's. I mean, you've been
Mhm.
reading it for so
Sure,
long.
sure,
Go
sure,
read it with somebody. Read it with
sure. Mhm.
somebody, and read it with Jarena Lee or Virginia Broughton.
That's right. That's right. That's good. That's good.
Blessing.
Well, folks, thank you all so much for being here. We're at the hour. So again, let's thank Dr. Smith in the chat here for her wonderful and wonderful work, her graciousness to be with us this evening. And please be on the lookout. Be on the lookout for upcoming lectures in the spring for our students and our community. We've got some more lectures coming up in the spring, in February and April, from other scholars, other practitioners as well. So we'll be in touch via email about those upcoming lectures. Thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful week, and hope we have a safe and happy holiday next week as we enter the holiday week. Y'all have to take good care this evening. All right. Thank you again, Dr. Smith. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Blessings to you.
Yes, yeah.
Bye.